Is there any betrayal more agonizing than realizing the man you intended to spend your life with views you as nothing more than a naive, aging ATM? When I opened that empty jewelry box, my heart didn't just shatter because a $200,000 necklace was gone. It withered because I realized I had been nursing a viper in my own home. Julian didn't steal it out of desperation. He took it to buy a Hermes bag for his ex-girlfriend, only to look me in the eye and laugh. "Don't overreact, Carmen. You have plenty of money. Just consider it a donation." He looked at me with pity, as if being deceived was my destiny because I was supposedly past my prime for real love. He was certain that for the sake of appearances and to protect my reputation as a successful woman, I would swallow my pride and stay silent. But Julian made a fatal mistake. He forgot that I didn't climb to the top of title operations through weakness. He thinks I am his prey, but in reality, he is just a piece of trash documentation that I am about to liquidate. Listen closely to this story because I am going to show you exactly how a woman who has been dismissed reclaims her honor. There will be no screaming and no public brawls. There will only be lethal contracts and a legal trap so flawlessly laid that it will bring Julian to his knees, begging for mercy at his own lavish gala. I promise you, the moment this arrogant man realizes he has personally signed his own death warrant and faces the police right in front of his mistress, it will be the most satisfying payoff you have ever witnessed. Don't go anywhere because my plan has only just begun. My name is Carmen, and at 58 years old, I have built a life defined by precision, serving as a senior title operations manager, where I oversee the complex legal history of high-value estates. My career has taught me that every asset has a story, and every discrepancy is a red flag, a philosophy that allowed me to believe I could audit my way into a secure, late-life romance with a man who seemed to value my stability as much as I valued his charm. The morning I opened my velvet-lined jewelry box was like any other Tuesday. Yet, the air in my dressing room suddenly felt thin and recycled as I stared at the empty indentation where my $200,000 diamond heirloom should have been. For most women, such a discovery would trigger a frantic search or a piercing scream, but 30 years of examining title defects have conditioned me to meet chaos with a chilling, analytical silence. I did not gasp or throw my hands to my face. Instead, I sat perfectly still, my eyes scanning the undisturbed lock of the mahogany box, noting that there were no signs of forced entry or hurried fumbling. My mind immediately shifted into a professional audit, mentally cross-referencing my digital insurance records and the most recent appraisal history I had updated just 3 months prior. This was not the work of a panicked burglar or a desperate stranger. This was a calculated extraction by someone who moved with the confidence of an invited guest. I felt a cold, familiar sensation in my chest, not the heat of heartbreak, but the icy clarity of a risk assessment. I moved to my home office and pulled up the security logs for my cloud-synced safe, my fingers moving across the keyboard with a rhythmic, detached speed. As I saw the timestamps, I knew the intruder hadn't broken in. They had simply used a code I had provided in a moment of misplaced intimacy. I didn't go looking for Julian to beg for answers. I waited for him to come to me, watching him from the kitchen island as he sauntered into the room with that practiced, effortless grace that had once made my heart skip a beat. When I calmly mentioned that the necklace was missing, Julian didn't flinch or offer to call the police. Instead, he tilted his head back and let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed off the granite countertops. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms with an infuriating air of superiority, and told me that I was being predictably dramatic over what he called just a piece of metal. He spoke to me with a patronizing tone, suggesting that at my age I should be focused on the spiritual side of our union, rather than clinging to material relics of the past. It was a classic gaslighting maneuver, an attempt to make me feel small and hysterical for noticing a massive hole in my net worth. He chuckled softly, moving closer to pat my hand as if I were a confused child, and murmured that I was far too intelligent and dignified to cause a social scene that would only embarrass us both in front of our circle of friends. He was testing me, measuring the depth of my submissiveness and betting on the fact that my professional pride would keep me silent to avoid the stigma of being a victim. While he spoke, my phone vibrated on the counter, and a notification from a social media monitoring app I used for work caught my eye. It was a photo of Julian's ex-girlfriend, a woman 10 years my junior who had never worked a day in her life, posing with a brand new, limited edition designer handbag. The timestamp of her post was a near-perfect match for the window of time my necklace had disappeared. When I showed him the screen, Julian didn't even bother to deny the connection. His laughter grew louder, more jagged, as he admitted through a smirk that I would have never even realized it was gone if he hadn't dropped hints to see how long it would take me to notice. He implied that I was becoming slow, that my years were finally catching up to my wits, and that he was simply doing what was necessary to keep his life vibrant while I remained buried in my dusty files. In that moment, the last flickering ember of love I held for him vanished, replaced by a searing, white-hot professional instinct. I stopped seeing a fiancé and started seeing a massive liability, a fraudulent entry in the ledger of my life that needed to be liquidated with extreme prejudice. He thought he was playing a game of wits with a retired heart, but he failed to realize that he was standing in the middle of a crime scene where I held all the evidence. I watched him walk away, still chuckling at his own perceived brilliance, while I quietly opened a new encrypted file on my laptop to begin the documentation process. That wasn't just a laugh of arrogance. It was a confession of war, and he had no idea I was already recording the battlefield. As Julian's laughter faded down the hallway, leaving behind nothing but the stale scent of his expensive cologne and the echo of his mockery, I remained seated in the silence of my office, feeling the heavy transformation of my own soul. For months, he had been meticulously constructing a cage made of subtle compliments, weaving a narrative that I was the perfect, stable, and sensible woman who was far above the petty theatrics of lesser couples. He used to hold my hand over dinner and tell me how much he admired my maturity, whispering that he had finally found a partner who wasn't like those dramatic, hysterical women who made life a constant battlefield of emotions. At the time, I wore those words like a badge of honor, believing I was being praised for my strength and my professional composure. But in the cold light of his betrayal, I realized those weren't compliments at all. They were strategic reinforcements designed to keep me quiet, a form of psychological grooming intended to ensure that when he eventually began to bleed my accounts dry, I would be too committed to my persona of the rational woman to ever raise my voice in protest. He had cast me in the role of the silent benefactor, the reliable anchor who would provide him with the lifestyle he craved, while he drifted into the arms of others, assuming that my trusting nature was a sign of intellectual laziness rather than a choice of the heart. Julian had spent the last year slowly encroaching on my financial boundaries, taking over small decisions and signing documents under the guise of saving me time, always framing his overreach as a romantic gesture of support for a busy executive. He assumed that because I was successful and focused on high-level operations, I wouldn't bother to audit the micro details of my own domestic life. But he made the mistake of forgetting that a title operations manager lives and breathes in the fine print. I stood up and walked to my bookshelf, pulling out a disguised ledger that contained the private records of my personal holdings, and as I began to cross-reference our joint expenses against my individual accounts, the illusion of our partnership dissolved into a stark paper trail of negligence. I unearthed a series of unexplained wire transfers hidden behind vague descriptions like consulting fees and property maintenance items I had glanced at months ago but dismissed because I wanted to believe in the man I loved. I saw the patterns now, the way he had been siphoning off just enough to be noticed, but not enough to trigger an immediate alarm, and the way his ex-girlfriend's presence seemed to haunt the margins of every credit card statement I reviewed. There were dinner reservations at places he claimed he never visited, and jewelry repair bills for items I didn't own, all meticulously organized by date and amount in my mind, as I built a formal dossier of his treachery. Each discovery was like finding a defect in a property title, a lien on my heart that made the entire investment toxic and unrecoverable. The theft of the $200,000 heirloom was merely the grand finale of a long-term con he had been running since the moment he proposed a desperate move by a man who realized his window of opportunity was closing as our wedding date approached. My mind shifted gears, grinding away the last remnants of the heartbroken woman who had once envisioned a graceful retirement with this man replaced by the cold, calculating efficiency of a risk analyst preparing for a hostile takeover. I stopped asking the useless emotional question of why he would do this to me and started focusing on the only thing that mattered: how to liquidate his influence and erase his presence from my life without leaving a single trace of my own vulnerability behind. This was no longer a marriage I was preparing for. It was a liquidation of a bad asset, a strategic removal of a parasitic entity that had mistakenly identified me as an easy mark. I viewed our upcoming union through the lens of my profession, seeing Julian as a fraudulent claim that needed to be cleared before the final closing, and I began to draft my countermove with a steady hand. I knew that Julian's greatest weakness was his own narcissism, his absolute certainty that he was the smartest person in the room and that I was far too predictable to ever deviate from the script he had written for me. To exploit this, I decided to play into his narrative perfectly, maintaining my mask of the stable, unsuspecting bride-to-be, while I set a trap that would catch him in his own arrogance. I drove to a high-end costume jeweler across town, a place that specialized in museum-quality replicas for film and high-society events, where the real gems were too risky to wear. I commissioned a perfect copy of the stolen heirloom, a piece so convincing that only a jeweler's loupe could tell the difference, and when I brought it home, I placed it back into the velvet-lined mahogany box in my dressing room. I didn't hide it. I left it exactly where it belonged, knowing that the moment Julian saw it, the seeds of paranoia would take root in his mind. He would wonder if his ex-girlfriend had lied to him, if the fence he used had cheated him, or if I had somehow replaced the treasure he thought he had stolen. By reintroducing the object of his crime into our shared space, I was reclaiming the power of the narrative, turning my home into a psychological battlefield where he would be forced to question his own reality while I watched him from behind a veil of professional indifference. I spent the rest of the evening behaving exactly as he expected, discussing the floral arrangements for our gala and the seating charts for our guests, all while my internal database was cataloging his every twitch and hesitation. He looked at me with that same smug, self-satisfied smile, completely unaware that he was now the subject of a high-stakes investigation, and that I was meticulously documenting every lie he told as if it were a sworn deposition. The emotional Carmen who had cried over his laughter was dead buried under the weight of 30 years of legal expertise and a newfound thirst for a very specific kind of justice. I watched him pour a glass of wine, his hands steady and his ego inflated, and I felt a sense of calm that only comes when you know you have already won the game before your opponent even realizes it has started. I was no longer a victim of a theft. I was the architect of a catastrophe that was about to consume everything Julian held dear, and I would do it with the same quiet precision I used to close a multi-million-dollar real estate deal. I stopped mourning the man I thought he was and started preparing the paperwork for the man he actually is. The days following my placement of the replica necklace back in the safe were filled with a deceptive heavy stillness that Julian mistook for my absolute surrender. He moved through the house with a newfound boldness, his strides longer, and his voice carrying a note of triumphant ownership that made my skin crawl with professional distaste. I watched him from the periphery, playing the role of the busy but devoted bride-to-be, while my mind remained tethered to the cold digital reality of the audit I was secretly conducting during the late hours of the night. It was during one of these deep dives into our shared digital cloud, a space Julian believed he had mastered, but had actually only scratched the surface of that. I stumbled upon a hidden subfolder encrypted with a password he had foolishly reused from his old college email. As the folder opened, the air in my home office seemed to drop 20 degrees and the blood in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. I wasn't just looking at evidence of petty theft anymore. I was staring at a massive $5 million life insurance policy Julian had secretly initiated in my name with himself, listed as the sole primary beneficiary upon the date of our marriage. My breath hitched as I scrolled through the digital application, noting that he had forged my electronic signature using a high-resolution scan of a document I had signed for him months ago. This was no longer about a gold digger looking for a luxurious lifestyle or a designer bag for a mistress. This was predatory intent of the darkest kind. Julian wasn't just waiting for me to be his wife. He was positioning himself to be my wealthy widower, targeting my very existence for a massive payout that would fund his infidelities for the rest of his life. The stakes had elevated from a financial dispute to a matter of survival, and the chilling realization that the man sleeping in the next room viewed my heartbeat as a countdown to his payday sent a wave of nausea through my stomach. But as a title operations manager, I knew that panic was a luxury I couldn't afford, so I forced myself to keep scrolling, unearthing even more sinister paperwork buried within his hidden files. I found a series of draft documents titled Asset Consolidation and Unified Estate Management Legal Instruments Julian had carefully prepared for our wedding day under the guise of simplifying our lives. These weren't standard prenuptial agreements designed to protect both parties. They were predatory contracts that, once signed, would legally strip me of the sole ownership of my real estate holdings, my retirement funds, and the liquid assets I had spent 35 years accumulating. He had structured them with such deceptive complexity that a layperson would see only a merging of lives, but my trained eye saw the hidden clauses that granted him total unilateral control over every cent I owned the moment the ink was dry. I finally understood the true purpose of the necklace theft. It had been a cold, calculated litmus test to see if I was the kind of woman who would fight back, or the kind of woman who would stay quiet to preserve a false sense of peace. Because I had played the part of the submissive partner, allowing him to laugh in my face, without calling the authorities, he had convinced himself that I was the perfect docile lamb, ready to be fleeced of everything I owned, and then eventually disposed of for an insurance windfall. The sheer arrogance of his plan was almost as insulting as the betrayal itself, but it provided me with the ultimate tactical advantage. Julian believed he was the only one playing a game. I didn't confront him with the evidence, and I didn't flee the house in a fit of rage because I knew that in the world of high-stakes asset management, the first person to show their hand is the one who loses. Instead, I initiated a counterintelligence operation that would have made a corporate litigator proud, reaching out to a trusted network of legal associates and forensic accountants I had worked with for decades. I began a meticulous process of editing the very documents Julian had drafted using my deep knowledge of title law and contract loopholes to create a trap of my own. I replaced his predatory clauses with mirrored language that looked identical to the untrained eye but carried a completely different legal weight. In my version of the asset consolidation agreement, any admission of unauthorized asset liquidation, like the sale of a stolen heirloom, would trigger an immediate, irrevocable confession of financial liability and a total waiver of any claims to my estate. I was building a legal cage disguised as a wedding gift, a document that would look like a merger to him, but would function as a comprehensive admission of guilt once signed. To ensure he walked into the trap without suspicion, I leaned into the role of the perfect unsuspecting bride, even more convincingly, feigning a sudden renewed interest in his generous idea of merging our assets for our future together. I would sit with him in the evenings, sipping tea and discussing the beautiful life we would build, watching the predatory glint in his eyes grow brighter as he believed his victory was imminent. I allowed him to see me as a woman who was finally softening a woman who was so blinded by her desire for a late-life companion that she was willing to sign away her autonomy for a bit of affection. Every time he touched my shoulder or smiled that smug, self-satisfied smile, I felt a surge of cold, focused energy reminding me that I wasn't just protecting my money. I was reclaiming my dignity from a man who thought I was too old to be dangerous. I worked through the night to ensure that every line of the modified documents was airtight, creating a digital trail that would make it impossible for him to claim he hadn't understood what he was signing. Julian thought he was the architect of my downfall, but he was merely providing the materials for his own destruction, and I was the one overseeing the construction. The gala was approaching the event he intended to use as the stage for his ultimate triumph, but I was the one who was truly directing the play. I felt a sense of profound, icy clarity as I saved the final version of the trap document to a secure drive, knowing that the man in the other room was dreaming of a fortune that would never be his. He thought he had measured my silence and found it lacking in strength, But he had failed to realize that silence is the most dangerous tool in a professional auditor's arsenal. The necklace was a test of my patience, but the marriage license was meant to be my death warrant, and I was about to make him sign it. The evening of the pre-wedding gala arrived with a crisp, deceptive elegance that mirrored the state of my own meticulously prepared heart. The venue was a historic manor draped in cascading white orchids and shimmering crystal, a backdrop Julian had insisted upon to broadcast our shared success to the elite circles of our city. I stepped out of the limousine wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to my frame with a regal authority, my skin glowing with a radiance that Julian surely mistook for the flush of a blushing bride rather than the cold fire of a woman about to execute a hostile takeover. As we entered the grand ballroom, Julian slipped his arm around my waist, his grip firm and possessive, broadcasting to every high society friend and business associate in the room that he had successfully tamed the formidable Carmen. I could feel the waves of his overconfidence radiating off him like a physical heat. He moved through the crowd with the swagger of a man who believed he had won the ultimate lottery, convinced that his gaslighting and the theft of my heirloom had gone unpunished. He leaned in to whisper sweet, empty praises into my ear, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and triumph, clearly believing that my silence over the past week was the silence of a woman who had accepted her role as his quiet benefactor. I played my part to perfection, offering gracious smiles and steady handshakes to our guests, projecting an image of such serene composure that even Julian's most cynical associates seemed convinced of our perfect union. The social high ground was mine, and I held it with a poise that allowed Julian to let his guard down completely, his arrogance blinding him to the fact that every pleasantry I exchanged was a calculated move to solidify my own standing before the storm. The air in the room shifted when his ex-girlfriend Elena made her entrance draped in a dress that was far too tight and clutching a limited edition handbag that practically screamed its $200,000 origin. I saw Julian's eyes dart toward her, a momentary flicker of panic crossing his face, before he realized I was looking directly at him with a pleasant, mask-like smile. Instead of turning away or creating the scene he expected, I glided across the polished marble floor toward her, the crowd parting like the Red Sea before my quiet intensity. I reached out and gently touched the smooth leather of her bag, my voice projecting just loud enough to reach the ears of the influential women standing nearby as I complimented her on her exquisite taste. I told her, with a chillingly sweet edge to my tone, that the bag was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, and that I knew exactly which special private fund had been liquidated to afford such a rare treasure. Elena's face went pale beneath her heavy makeup, and Julian, who had hurried over to intervene, stood frozen as the tension in the room became thick enough to choke on. I didn't look at him. I kept my gaze fixed on Elena, offering her a dignified nod that made her look like a common thief caught in a spotlight while I remained the undisputed queen of the ballroom. The public humiliation was silent, but absolute. Everyone in our circle knew my family history and my penchant for audits, and the subtle implication that Julian was using my resources to fund his mistress began to ripple through the room like a poison. Julian tried to laugh it off, his voice sounding strained and thin as he attempted to steer me away, but his self-assurance was beginning to fray at the edges. Sensing his growing desperation to regain control, he waited until we were momentarily alone near the champagne fountain to pull a folded document from his tuxedo pocket, calling it a minor financial formality that would simplify our travel plans for the honeymoon. He looked at me with pleading, predatory eyes, hoping I would sign it right there in the heat of the celebration to validate his power over me one last time. I looked at the paper, then back at him, and gave him the most beautiful, deceptive smile I had ever conjured, suggesting that such an important milestone of trust deserved more than a hurried signature by a catering table. I framed it as a romantic gesture, telling him that we should sign our unified estate papers formally in front of our closest witnesses in the private study later that night, making it a true ceremony of our shared future. This stroke of ego-stroking was the final hook. I saw his chest swell with pride as he tucked the paper back into his pocket, his mind already calculating the millions he thought he was about to inherit. He walked back into the crowd, laughing loudly and ordering a round of the most expensive vintage for the room, completely unaware that he was skipping toward a professional and legal gallows of his own making. I watched him from the shadows of the arched doorway, a title operations manager watching a fraudulent claim move toward the final closing. Every guest who raised a glass to our health was in my mind a witness to the dossier I was about to finalize. Julian thought he was the master of ceremonies, but he was merely the entertainment I had provided before the real work began. The music swelled a triumphant orchestral piece that Julian had chosen to underscore his moment of victory, and as he toasted the room, I felt a profound, icy calm settle over me. He thought the applause in the room was for his victory. He didn't realize it was the soundtrack to his final act. The golden light of the ballroom felt like a fading dream as I led Julian and three of our most prominent associates, a retired judge, a bank president, and my own attorney, into the mahogany-paneled sanctuary of the private study. Julian moved with a predatory swagger, his eyes fixed on the leather-bound folder resting on the desk as if it were the crown jewels of his new empire. He didn't even notice the strategic way I positioned the witnesses around the room, ensuring that every movement would be observed by eyes trained to recognize the gravity of a legal ceremony. I presented the document with a hand that was as steady as a surgeon's, my voice dropping into the rhythmic professional cadence I had used to close 1,000 multi-million-dollar deals. I told him that this was the moment our lives truly became one, a merging of estates that would protect us both for decades to come, playing perfectly into his belief that my age had finally made me desperate for the security of his company. Julian didn't even bother to read the fine print. His greed had reached such a fever pitch that he saw only the signature line and the promise of the millions he believed lay just behind it. He snatched the fountain pen from the desk and scrawled his name with a flourish, his chest puffed out in a grotesque display of triumph. He looked up at me, that same mocking smirk from the day the necklace vanished beginning to form on his lips, but his expression froze when he realized I wasn't smiling back. I reached out and slid the document toward my attorney, my demeanor shifting instantly from the radiant, accommodating bride to the cold, lethal senior title operations manager who had spent 30 years liquidating fraudulent claims. I informed Julian in a voice that sounded like ice cracking on a frozen lake that he hadn't just signed a merger. He had signed a comprehensive affidavit of voluntary disclosure. By putting his name to that paper in front of 3 credible witnesses, he had legally acknowledged the unauthorized liquidation of my assets and admitted to the fraudulent use of my personal data for financial gain. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his, and revealed the final devastating truth. I had already filed a formal report for grand larceny with the police and initiated a fraud investigation with the insurance company over a week ago. I told him that while he was busy celebrating his perceived brilliance, I had been providing the authorities with a real-time dossier of his movements. By signing that affidavit, Julian had not claimed my fortune. He had just provided the state with a voluntary confession that would make his prosecution a mere formality. He tried to let out a hollow laugh, a desperate attempt to gaslight me one last time by claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding or a joke between lovers. But the retired judge standing by the door shook his head with a look of profound disgust. Julian's face turned a sickly translucent white, his hands beginning to tremble as the magnitude of his error finally pierced through his narcissism. He stammered about my lack of proof, but I was already opening my laptop to display the high-resolution GPS tracking data embedded in the replica necklace he had touched and moved multiple times over the last 48 hours. I showed him the digital trail of the $5 million life insurance policy he had forged, a document that was now sitting on the desk of a federal investigator. I calmly informed him that our engagement was a nullity, that my security team had already changed every lock on my properties, and that his mistress was currently being served as an accomplice in a conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. The man who had once stood in my kitchen and mocked my material loss was now a shattered shell leaning against my desk for support as his world collapsed into a legal abyss. He looked around the room for an ally, but he found only the cold, judgmental stares of the very society he had hoped to con. I stood up, smoothing the silk of my gown with a detached precision, watching as the tremors in his knees became uncontrollable. He had spent months casting me as a safe, predictable woman who was too old to fight back, never realizing that my years had given me the wisdom to build a cage he would never be able to escape. I walked toward the door, leaving him in the hands of the attorney and the witnesses who would ensure he didn't leave the room until the police arrived. As I crossed the threshold, I looked back one last time at the man who thought he could audit my heart and steal my future. He finally understood the difference between a girl who loves and a woman who manages titles. I don't just own my house, I own your future. The heavy oak doors of the study closed behind me with a final, satisfying thud, muffling the sound of Julian's frantic protests and the sharp-clipped tones of the officers who had been waiting just down the hall. I did not stay to watch him be led out in handcuffs, nor did I indulge in the theatricality of a public confrontation, because a woman of my standing knows that true power doesn't need to scream to be felt. In the weeks that followed, I watched from the serene distance of my high-rise office as the slow burn of justice began to consume everything Julian had tried to build on a foundation of lies. The legal system, a machinery I had navigated for decades, proved to be a far more effective instrument of retribution than any emotional outburst could ever be. Julian's fall from grace was not a sudden explosion, but a methodical dismantling of his entire existence. Without my signature to validate his credit and my reputation to shield his character, he was quickly exposed for the hollow opportunist he had always been. The very high society circles that had once toasted our union turned their backs on him with a chilling efficiency, deleting his name from guest lists and ignoring his desperate calls for financial assistance. His legal battles were exhaustive and expensive, draining what little remained of his personal resources until he was forced to sell his luxury car and move into a cramped apartment on the edge of the city he once thought he owned. Even more poetic was the departure of Elena, who vanished from his life the moment she realized her designer bags were being seized as evidence and that Julian was no longer the bottomless cash cow she had been promised. She didn't offer him a shred of loyalty, proving that a relationship built on stolen treasure is as flimsy as a title with a forged deed. I remained a silent observer to his ruin, never once initiating a public scandal or speaking his name in anger, knowing that his greatest punishment was the crushing weight of his own insignificance. My insurance claim for the heirloom necklace was processed with a swiftness that only comes from a perfectly documented file. And though the funds were returned to my accounts, the true recovery was far more profound than any monetary value. I had recovered the sense of self that Julian had tried to bury under layers of gaslighting and condescension. I found myself back in my element, presiding over board meetings with a sharper focus and a more formidable presence than ever before. There is a specific kind of freedom that comes to a woman in her late 50s when she realizes that her happiness is an internal asset, one that cannot be audited or stolen by a predatory partner. I began to travel solo again, rediscovering the joy of navigating the world on my own terms, from the quiet galleries of Florence to the rugged coastlines of Maine, proving to myself that my life was not a project waiting for a man to complete it. My home once again became a sanctuary of order and intelligence, a place where every document was vetted and every guest was worthy of the space they occupied. I spent my evenings reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this pinnacle of self-reliance, realizing that the very qualities Julian had mocked my precision, my age, my professional coldness, were the very weapons that had saved my life and my fortune. I think often of the millions of women who are told that their value diminishes with every passing year, and I wish I could tell each one of them that their experience is actually their greatest armor. We are not fragile because we have loved. We are dangerous because we have learned. I learned that you must never surrender the power of your own signature, for it is the ultimate expression of your autonomy and your worth in a world that will always try to take it from you. I stand now as a beacon for those who might mistake a woman's kindness for weakness, a reminder that a calm exterior often hides a mind that has already calculated the cost of your betrayal. Julian thought he was an architect, but he was merely a squatter in a house I had built with my own hands, and I evicted him with the same dispassionate grace I used to clear a clouded title. My life is no longer a shared ledger with a fraud. It is a solo masterpiece of my own design. He thought he could steal my history, but he only succeeded in making himself a footnote in my success story. The world looks different now, clearer and more vibrant because I am no longer viewing it through the lens of someone else's expectations. I have reinvested every ounce of the energy I once wasted on him back into the only venture that ever truly mattered. He thought I was calm because I was weak. He was wrong. I was calm because the file was already closed and I had already moved on to a much better investment, myself. If this story of professional precision and ultimate justice resonated with you, then make sure to subscribe to our channel and join a community of strong, independent voices who know that intelligence is the most powerful weapon of all. We want to hear from you in the comments below because your perspective adds the final layer to this narrative. Do you think Julian got what he truly deserved, or was Carmen too lenient by letting the legal system handle him instead of creating a public scene? Perhaps you have faced a similar situation where someone mistook your quiet nature for a lack of strength, and you had to show them exactly who was in charge. We value the wisdom of our audience, and your stories of empowerment and resilience are what keep this channel thriving as a sanctuary for those who refuse to be victims. By subscribing, you ensure that you never miss another masterpiece of revenge and redemption where the truth always finds its way into the light. Share your thoughts, share your victories, and let us know which part of Carmen's plan made you cheer the loudest, because your engagement is the heartbeat of our community, and we look forward to reading every single one of your insightful opinions.